This program is presented by Drake University on iTunes U, a service of the Drake Telemedia Center.
Good evening, everyone. Hi, I'm Brian Fellner. I'm Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of American Enterprise Group located here in Des Moines. I have the pleasure of serving as this year's President of the Iowa chapter of the Financial Executives International Organization, which is the premier financial association for senior financial executives in the United States and Canada. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to our 25th annual lecture, sponsored tonight by the Iowa chapter of Financial Executives and Drake University's College of Business and Public Administration. We at FEI love coming over to Drake to visit your campus on an annual basis, and once a year I actually feel really young getting to see all of you students. Actually had the opportunity to speak to some of our friends at Iowa State that were here, and was actually feeling quite young. And then between our discussion, I went to the restroom and looked in the mirror and realized that there was some bald guy in the mirror there. And it's nice to see, actually, in all seriousness, the enthusiasm of the student population and those that are on the second level there. Sorry if I am blinding you with the light coming down there.
You're still young.
Thank you, sir. In all seriousness, it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mr. Tom Coates. All of us are in a treat for his remarks tonight. Thank you, Tom, and absolutely enjoy watching your TV spots. I think we all enjoy it. We are very glad to have our faculty, administrators, and students from a wide variety of academic areas and several local regional colleges and universities in attendance tonight. It's great to see the collaborative efforts of both the public and private sector getting together. At this time, I'd like to take a few moments to tell you about FEI. FEI has been the voice of corporate finance for nearly 80 years and has over 15,000 members in the United States and Canada. Our local chapter has almost 90 professionals and are providing quality programming and networking opportunities since its founding in the state since 1944. Our local chapter meets monthly, providing professional development and continuing education for our members and for guests at our meetings. Each year, we address topics in professional fields such as ethics, business and career decisions, emerging trends, technology, economics, and other aspects affecting public and private companies. And we absolutely enjoy getting together and having dinner. Every year, our organization contributes to the National Research Foundation for the FEI, and we sponsor recognition of achievements in the local community, one accounting student and one finance student from each of the following universities: Drake, Grandview, Iowa State, Simpson, and the University of Northern Iowa. For many years, we've enjoyed a close relationship and partnership with our strategic business leaders in our community, such as Deloitte, Ernst & Young, KPMG, Robert Half, and the Davis Brown Law Firm. And I'd just like to thank them again for their participation with FEI. At this point, I'd like to introduce Steve Guerra, a member of our FEI chapter and an associate professor at Drake University. Thank you so much for your attendance this evening. I'm sure it's going to be a great program.
First, thank you, Brian, and thank you for coming tonight. I know, obviously, the weather's a lot nicer than it was yesterday. We never got snow, so hopefully I'll stay that way for a while. First, indicate this is the 25th year of this event, and so going back to 1987, this event has basically been designed to draw the students of Drake University and allow them to interact with the professional community here in Des Moines, both in terms of business, government, and, well, not-for-profit. And again, so hopefully you guys will get a lot out of this tonight. I'd like to touch first on a couple of housekeeping details. At the conclusion of Tom's remarks, there will be a question and answer session. And two things about the Q&A. First of all, you can't have Q&A without the Q. So feel free to ask questions when we're done, okay? Obviously, I'm sure after this presentation you probably will have some good questions you want to ask and get answers for. Feel free to ask those questions. Also, I'm kind of asked also, as a sort of just a courtesy, more or less, that at the conclusion of the presentation, if you're not going to be staying for the Q&A, to at least sort of, remain in your seats for as long as possible, because sort of when you exit the room, in this room, it kind of gets very noisy when the seats come back up again, so just be careful about that. Now, by way of an introduction, Mr. Tom Coates, who's a native Iowan and a Simpson College graduate, so from our friends down in Enola, is currently the executive director and co-founder of Consumer Credit of Des Moines. You probably have seen the commercials, who has not, where Tom is trying to send a very serious message, but with a little humorous tone. And I'm sure that's, we'll hear a very important message tonight as well. Tom's a well-known advocate on consumer credit as well as gambling issues. And he has been seen on television, as I indicated before. He's also been seen on, or quoted in or interviewed with the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, as well as CBS News and even the BBC. So his message has actually resonated across the pond, as they say. Having said that, any further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Tom Coates.
Well, good evening. I'm honored and surprised. I did not expect this size of an audience. As I understand it from our conversation at dinner, some of you were coerced rather than drawn to this just by a natural, flame. The assignments apparently are out, and so that's the reason for some of you being here. But I'll try to make it somewhat of interest to you. As Stephen said at the outset, we've been, in fact, coincidentally, we're celebrating our 25th year anniversary as a company, just as the FEI is with their organization. We started back in 1987 as well. And about 15, 16 years ago, we decided to start doing TV ads. And over the period of time, we've done about 40 plus over the years. And as Stephen pointed out, we're trying to get a message across and keep it lighthearted and entertaining. And I've done things like ride horses, getting underwater and giving the message. I've even become a TV superstar and jump in as a cartoon character. So done a lot of things that were fun. And because of that visibility and the branding that we've had success with, I've had a lot of times people will come up to me and they will ask me very interesting questions and somehow think that I handle my own personal finances in some exalted, godlike fashion. And I want to assure you at the outset that that's not the case. I've made my share of mistakes. As an example, my lovely wife, who is with me tonight, and I were on a vacation recently. And during the course of that vacation, it turned out that one of her credit cards was stolen. Caused quite a bit of consternation. And as I checked into it, I ended up not reporting the theft because, as it turned out, the thief was using it less frequently than she was. And I always like to start off with a little bit of humor because some of what I'm going to say is not necessarily of a humorous vein, but I think in life we should try to take things as we can. Just like my TV commercials, I've tried to take a humorous vein oftentimes. And I think even in the midst of difficulties and tragedy, I think we can find some degree of humor. The story that I came across just today, somebody sent me out there. This is a good story. I think I'll tell this. This is about a couple that have been married almost as long as I and my wife have. I know in the bio, which turns out is 9 years out of date, it says that we've been married 28 years. We've actually been married 37 years. And we have 3 grown children and now 6 grandchildren, some of which you've probably seen in some of my TV commercials. But the couple in question had been married 35 years, and they had ended up going to marriage counseling. And As they got into the counseling session, the counselor said, well, what's the problem? And instantly, the wife launches into a passionate but very painful tirade over the problems and the deficiencies of her husband, going back to the inception of their marriage to date. And it was on and on and on. And finally, at a natural break, the counselor stood up, walked around his desk, asked her to stand up, and then very passionately embraced her, kissed her, hugged her, did that for quite a while, and to the raised eyebrow of the husband. Finally, he released her, and she sat back down in kind of a dazed condition, and he turned to the husband. He said, now, he said, this is what your wife needs 3 times a week. Can you do this? And he said, well, yes, I can bring her by here Monday and Wednesday, but Friday I fish. So I saw that. That's a good story. Has nothing to do with my talk, but I enjoyed the story. And you guys out here, the young fellows, probably can't fully appreciate that story until you get out, get married, and are in that situation for a few years, and then you'll be able to better appreciate it. All right, let me start off here going back, because I think it's helpful to give a little historical perspective. And if we go back in time to when I started, my wife started, my father and my mother all started the company, Consumer Credit of Des Moines, there was only 2 to 3 credit cards out there, outstanding, revolving, people were paying interest on, and it was $100 billion. $100 billion. The average line on that bank account, that credit card, the Visa and the MasterCard, was about $2,000. Now, if you take a look at the situation, let me see, because I like to ask this question. I was speaking just last week to some groups in Norwalk High School. I live in Norwalk, and I go in there once a semester, and I give them a little bit of the same talk I'm going to give you. Let me see a quick show of hands. How many of you in here already have at least 1 credit card? All right, most of you. Most of you. Okay. All right. If you take a survey, and I get this, again, people come up to me and they say, Mr. Coates, I want you to know that I handle my finances in a very responsible fashion. I have credit cards, but I keep them paid off. And I say, that's great. Glad to hear it. I've never met him before, maybe never see him again, but I'm glad to hear he's handling his credit in a responsible fashion. They do a survey, and they find that 66% of Americans that have credit cards, like most of you do, say they keep their credit cards paid off in full at the end of every month. But the reality is, and it has been for some years now, that 60% of Americans that have credit cards don't keep them paid off. They revolve a balance. And if we fast forward from 1987 to 2008, which was the year of the bubble burst, we had right at $1 trillion in credit card debt. And how that translated into the individual no longer had 2 to 3 credit cards, he had 8 to 10. The average line on that bank card was no longer $2,000, but between $5,000 and $6,000. And the amount of the household debt at the peak was between $9,000 and $10,000. Now that's on top, ladies and gentlemen, of the mortgages, the car loans, the student loans, the other types of debt obligations. That was simply the credit cards. So this country has gone through a dramatic shift. When we started consumer credit in 1987, I saw the trend lines. I had no idea we would see a 10-fold increase on what is arguably the most identifiable area of consumer debt that we have, the credit cards. I'm going to show you a few charts here. Here's a chart of the bankruptcy filings going back to about that same period. We were running about 500,000 personal bankruptcies a year back in 1987-88. It jumped up to about 900,000 by 92, plateaued, ran up to about 1.4 million by 98, plateaued again. It shot up to 1.6 million in 03. And then by 05, it shot up to over 2 million when they changed the bankruptcy laws. And just kind of an FYI, the bankruptcy laws were changed, and it made it more difficult. So it pushed forward the demand on the filings. You can see the next year it dropped down significantly, but it did some things. It created a means test. It means that if you earn income that's above the median income in your geographical area and there are not significant other circumstances, you'll probably be denied the ability to discharge under Chapter 7. They're trying to push, at that point, many people more to file Chapter 13, which is a wage earners plan. It also requires, and we do about 100 of these a month, pre-bankruptcy counseling. An hour session with a counselor going through in some detail their finances, much as we do for anybody else. And these types of things, and the attorneys that charge for bankruptcy, most of them pretty much doubled their fees once this came into play because it required a lot more of them than they'd ever had to do before. By 2008, it started working its way back up to $1 million, and now these days it's back up to about $1.5 million personal bankruptcy filings. So we're back up to where we were pre-law change a few years ago. Household debt, as I mentioned, in 1987-88, we were running right at about $100 billion in credit card debt. We had $3 trillion in total household debt as a starting point, and you can see that the total amount of household debt worked its way up to almost $14 trillion by the time the bubble burst in 2008. I think it's helpful because there was a late Senator Everett Dirksen some years ago, who said in a Senate hearing, $1 million here, $1 million there, pretty soon you're talking about real money. And pretty soon it became not $1 million, but $1 billion here and $1 billion here. And they throw these numbers around. And so I wanted to show you visually what makes up $1 billion, because it is hard to get your mind around it. If you'll see on the overhead, there is a stack of $100 bills that equals $10,000. Do you see it? 100 of these stacks would equal $1 million, and 10 pallets of 1,000 stacks of $1 million equals what you see in front of you, $1 billion. So now we're not into the B's, but we're into the T's, trillions. I think it's helpful if we can get a visual on what that looks like. This is what $1 trillion looks like, ladies and gentlemen. You notice figure says I'm down here. Notice these pallets are all double stacked. Before you just saw the single stack. These are all double stacked, otherwise they wouldn't fit on the slide. And so when we start talking about $1 trillion here and $1 trillion here, we are talking about a very significant amount. And I know I'm talking to people that are predisposed to understand numbers, accountants and people that deal with finances. And so you probably already have a pretty good idea. I show this to people and they kind of gasp a little bit. They don't really understand what $1 trillion looks like. Now you multiply this by 15 for our national debt. You multiply it by another 13 for our private debt, and you take about another $80 trillion in unfunded entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and you have about 100 times what you see on the screen in front of you in obligations. That counts to about $300,000 for every man, woman, and child in this country before you ever start dealing with your own finances. It's staggering and it is sobering. And I say there's not much funny about this, but it is what it is. And I guess the message that I want to give at the start is that there's only so much we can do about this. I understand you're going to have some of the Republican candidates for president coming in, and I applaud you for getting a piece of that action. And Iowa does have a disproportionate amount of political hold on the nation for that reason. But the main thing we can do is our personal finances, and that's what I'm going to eventually get to here in this presentation. This chart, I think, is interesting, and the baseline on this year is 1954, which is, by the way, the year I was born. If we had increased government size and spending in line with inflation and the population growth, you can see the growth that would have transpired in the lower red line. The reality of what's happened is the blue line, the total government spending, and the programs that have mushroomed in my lifetime have been staggering, and that chart was put together in 2008, and you can add another 25 to 30% on top of that because we've grown that much more. The people that are disgruntled need to focus in on what's really choking us off, and that is the extent and the size and the cost of our federal government. We're seeing played out in front of us what's happened over in Greece. We're not too far from there unless we get this ship righted, and it's going to take a lot of doing because there's a lot of vested interest that once you start shaking that tree, they all come out. I'm going to skip through some of these. This is kind of an interesting one. We used to save as a nation about 7 to 8%. That means if you made $1,000 in earnings, you'd put about $80 aside into savings. And that held up till about 1992, as you can see on the chart, and it started dropping off the face of the earth. And by the 2000s, 05, 06, 07, and part of 08, we were down bumping at zero, or in some cases negative savings in this country. Started turning back up, and the good news here is that after the bubble burst in 08, and the bubble that I keep referring to is that inevitably occurred once the Federal Reserve pumped enough money at artificially low interest rates into our economy for a while. It took its form in the high-tech bubble in the 90s, and I remember having a wager with my now adult son who was then in school. He was caught up, as many other people were, in the high-tech, and I said, I don't think it's going to continue. And so we had a bet. He chose 5 high-tech stocks at the start of 2000. I wrote down the price. At the end of the year, I said, at the end of the year, if majority of these stocks are higher rather than lower, I'll buy you whatever it is you want. And I don't remember what it was we had the wager over. And, of course, if I won, I only won satisfaction. By the end of the year, not only were all 5 a lot lower, some of them were a tenth of what they were. Now, that was the high-tech bubble bursting in 2000. That money immediately transferred to the real estate market. And the good news is that with the bubble bursting, we've seen a climb back up in savings rates. We've been saving between 4 and 6% now, so we're back up to a decent level of private savings. At the same time, I mentioned to you that at the peak of 2008, we had right at $1 trillion in credit card debt. Now, that had been an expanding bubble that had been going on for over 50 years. Throughout my lifetime, throughout most all your lifetime, we've seen nothing but an expanding model until the bubble burst in 08. Now we've seen 10 straight quarters of consumer debt paydown. That's never happened in the 50-plus years till that point. And now we have the credit card debt, not at $1 trillion, but now under $800 billion. Still a big number. But 10 straight quarters of consumer debt paydown coupled with a return to savings on the part of the American people means the American people get it. It would be nice if our federal government got it. Here's gross private savings to illustrate that point. You can see the bottom hitting in there in about 07, 08, heading up, and through 11, they had consistently started saving again. Here's the government's reaction to that same scenario. They have been spending money at a level that is clearly not sustainable, and it does have consequences. But that's the government's. And what happened in Japan? Japan's bubble burst in 1990. They've had 21 years of stimulus, spending money, and now they're the most heavily indebted industrialized nation in the world, and still in their economic malaise. Nothing to show for it. Housing market, as I mentioned to you, was the recipient of that money and that artificially low interest rates, and we ran up there where we peaked out actually in 05. Some people will tell you 06, but it wasn't really understood until we got into 07 and 08 that the real estate market was a house of cards. I remember a call that I received quite a few years now ago from a woman. In fact, it may have been about the time that I did 10, 12 years ago, I did a commercial where it showed the house lifting up in back of me, off its foundation, taking off like a rocket. And my message was, if you weren't careful how you use the equity in your home, you could lose it. And that, of course, was prophetic, because that's what happened to a lot of people. And the woman said, I've been told to call you, Mr. Coates, because I want to borrow $20,000 against my home to pay off my credit card debt. I said, okay, I'll ask you a few questions. Interest rate, what interest rate are they going to charge you? She said 15%. I don't have the best credit. Said, but that's cheaper than my credit cards. I said, okay, how many points? Well, they told me not to worry about it because they're going to wrap that into the loan, but I'm going to charge me 5. Well, that's pretty high. I said, you have a first mortgage? She said, yes. You have a second mortgage? She said, yes, I do. I said, how long have you had that second mortgage? She said, about 2 years. I said, okay, last question, then I'll try to answer your question. When you took out that second mortgage 2 years ago, what did you use the proceeds for? Anybody ahead of me here? She used it to pay off her credit card debt. Now, the light bulb, I often say the light bulb goes off in the people's heads that we counsel. But the light bulb went off over my head, and I thought to myself at that point, and I've used this in illustration to talk about the housing situation, this was a microcosm of what was going on all over the country. People were using their houses that had quickly increasing values as a giant ATM machine. We haven't seen wages in this country really go up since the 70s. It's an illusion to think that just because the average earnings are higher today, that the real buying power is any greater. It continues to actually decline, and so with the wage malaise that we've seen for decades, many people want, because Madison Avenue tells them that they not only have an opportunity, but a right to have a nice lifestyle. I talk about my TV commercials. I remember the one some years ago when the things were still booming. And the guy was out, and he was in front of a nice new house, and he had a beautiful car, and he was driving a new lawnmower, and he had a golf country membership, and he said, "How can I afford all this?" And he said, "I can't." He said, "I'm in debt up my eyeballs." Unfortunately, the commercial was not to change your lifestyle, but it was to refinance and continue. And that's what many people did till they no longer could do it. And the opportunities that this represented to me was that many people around this country were taking their homes and using the equity, which became an illusion, to finance a lifestyle that was clearly not affordable. Now, the other kind of person that ran into trouble, and I'll show you this one. By 1995, most houses in this country were affordable. 2005, much of it was severely unaffordable. Many of those people were playing what I call the bigger sucker theory. They were figuring that, yeah, I'm paying too much for this house today, but it's gone up 10, 15, 20% in a year, the last few years. It'll go up that much the next few years. I'm going to leverage myself. I'm going to buy this house. It's going to continue to go up, and then I'm going to flip it and make a lot of money. They're not making any more of it. You can't go wrong. And when you see the cab drivers, around the city, going to their credit cards or getting second mortgages on their house to buy real estate, you knew that was a problem. And by 2005, much of the houses were significantly overpriced. And now, there was a gentleman at the table tonight that came from Arizona. I don't remember his name. He's one of your newest employees here. And he's looking forward to our Iowa winters, aren't you? Yes. I gave him an idea what that was going to be like. But in Arizona, the real estate market has dropped by over 60%. Florida, Las Vegas, much of California. We haven't had that significant drop, in part because the Iowa economy is based on finance and insurance, which has been reasonably stable, and the agriculture market, which has boomed during the last few years. That may be coming to an end not too far off either. But those things have kept our real estate markets relatively stable. Some have gone down a bit, but nothing to the tune of 60%. But you can imagine, if you had financed your home time and time again and maxed out that equity, that all of a sudden the house drops down in value, 20, 30, 40, 50% or more. As Warren Buffett said, when the tide goes back out, we see who's swimming naked, and we now see that a lot of the homeowners are swimming naked out there. The housing market is going to take a while to unwind. It's been tough, and every time the federal government manipulates, ostensibly for good purposes, they further put off the bottoming. And the bottom is what we need so we can start building back up instead of trillions of dollars in more debt. All right, now I want to transfer over. In the housing, let me also say this at the outset, because it's not part of my presentation, but I think I need to put it in. And most everybody in this room is acutely aware of the issue of student loans. And increasingly, it's when I talk to especially the high school students I did last week, I warn them that there is a huge trap out there in regards to the student loan market. We were talking earlier at the cocktail party about our own situation. My own, I went to Simpson back in the 70s. I worked in my grandfather's snowplow manufacturing plant. That wasn't what I wanted to do, and I hated, and I didn't want to do that for a summer job. So I hit on the idea to form a spray painting company, and I hired some young guys that were also going to college, and we spray painted. And I made $5,000–6,000 a year with paint commission and labor, and doesn't sound like a lot maybe, but in 1970s, early 70s, that was a good bit of money, because the tuition at Simpson at that point was a couple $1,000s a year. When I and my wife got married in 1974, we lived across the campus in an apartment that we paid $100 a month for, and that included utilities. Wasn't a bad place. I got through without any debt. That's not so possible today, because let's go back to that 25-year point that your organization is talking about, that we're about to celebrate 25 years. 25 years ago, to date, and you index this for inflation, the cost of higher education, I was just apprised of this the other day as I was listening to a show, 440% increase in the price of higher education across this country from where it was 25 years ago. And that, again, is indexed for inflation. There's nothing else that you can point to that has escalated like that. They talk about the cost of medical care. It hasn't gone up that much. And you can argue that there has been some more advances in the area of medicine than there have been in education. I think that and the housing both look back to the federal government with some degree of blame because of the emphasis and the money that's been pushed into this. I think some of the roots of the cost of education can both be looked at back to the government. I like to look back at the source waters, and I think the government is our source waters. And I think if the people on Occupy Wall Street could understand that a little better, they wouldn't be worrying about the banks. They'd be in Washington, D.C. All right, let's go to the individual situation. Get it off the macro. We'll go to individuals. The credit card is a great tool. In fact, when I talked to the group of high school students this last week, I encouraged them to go out and get a credit card. Now, when I used to do the talk, I've been talking at that high school for close to 20 years now. When I used to do the talk during the late 90s and into 2000s, a quarter to maybe 40% of the class would already have credit cards. It's not quite so easy today. So I advise them to get it, but use it wisely. And I said, here's the trap. You go into a situation, and let's say you're a few years down the road, you've got a young family, and you decide, well, we put this off long enough, let's go on a vacation. Now, you haven't put any money aside for the vacation, but you think it's time for a vacation, and you use a credit card. Go down to Disney World. Been down there. It's a fun place. You take the kids down there, they ride the rides, you get a chance to slap hands with Mickey, and you're having a good time. Stay down there for a week or so, and you fly back, and at the end of the time, you get a greeting card from Bank of America. It says, congratulations, you know Alice, $5,000, like it says on the screen, 20% annualized interest, $100 minimum monthly payments. Now, if you put the card away and you keep your payments flat, because as that debt amortizes, you can start to drop the payment down, but you leave it flat at $100, the minimum amount it starts out with, and you don't use the card anymore, it takes you 9 years to repay. And at the end, you will have repaid the $5,000 in principal plus $5,800 in interest. What do you have to show for it? 9 years earlier, you took the family to Disney World. You've got some nice pictures and some memories. But you haven't improved your lifestyle at all. And the Bible talks about the wisest ruler of all time being Solomon. Solomon wrote in the Bible that the borrower becomes the slave of the lender. Now, that was true thousands of years ago. I know our technology is highly advanced. We have all sorts of fancy ways to spend and borrow money today. But the fundamental element of human nature remains the same. The borrower becomes the slave of the lender. And what you've done is, with that vacation to Disney World, you put yourself into a position of servitude for the next 9 years. And what do you have to show for it? And that is the problem. They did a study years ago that showed that if you used a credit card to make a retail purchase, you end up spending 34% more for that purchase than if you used cash or wrote a check. It creates an illusion of what you can afford because at the end of the month, you don't have enough money to pay it all off. You just pay that minimum payment and you keep going. And you'll argue, I'll take care of it next month. Now, we had a fellow in our office 2 weeks ago that is an attorney up in northern Iowa. He traveled all the way down to see us on a Friday afternoon. I visited with him at some length. He said, I made good money. He said, I have no one to blame. And as I mentioned, the bankruptcy laws have changed. He makes too much to file. He has between $200,000 and $300,000 in credit card debt. He's in his 60s. He's an attorney in northern Iowa. He has a prominent position in the community, and he's between the worst rock and a hard place that many of us, from a financial standpoint, can imagine. He doesn't have an easy way out. But it didn't start with him setting out to borrow $200,000 or $300,000 on his credit cards. It started with that little journey. Oh, I'll borrow it today and I'll pay it off tomorrow. Well, okay, I'm maxed out on this card, but I'll get another one. And I'll get my limits raised. And again, until the bubble burst, you could do that pretty easily. We've seen people come in with stacks of credit cards with big lines on them. It's incredible what some people are able to do. Not for themselves, but to themselves. Because oftentimes we're our own worst enemies. So, how many of you had the experience when you go into a retail establishment, they'll ask you if you want to save 15% today so that you can get one of their credit cards you want to take out? Let me see how many. Am I the only one? Okay. All right. So we've had that experience. You wonder why they do that. Well, they do it not just to make interest. In fact, in recent years, they haven't made that much interest on the credit cards. What they have is finding out that two things happen. When you have their particular piece of plastic in your pocket, you're more likely to revisit that particular store. And go back to what I said, 34% more is purchased if you have that plastic than if you're paying cash. They have a real motivation. You have a motivation to look out after your own situation. I'm going to talk about another one here in just a second. Let me show you this graphic. $20 minimum payments. Go back to that illustration I showed you. $1,000 balance, $20 minimum payments, 9 years to repay. If you just increase that payment, just double it from 20 to 40, you're not looking at 9 years. Now you're looking at 2.7 years, and you've had a net savings of $862 just by tweaking your budget regularly, paying a little bit more than the minimum payment. Now, here's the other big bugaboo that we deal with in our office. Although increasingly, I will say student loans are a problem. But cars. I mentioned the situation with houses. And recently, we've seen a situation that the house has become upside down for a lot of homeowners. That means that the valuation of the home is less than what they have against it. Now, that's been a recent phenomenon, but it's been that way with car financing for some years now. When I used to do a lot of one-on-one counseling in my office, I'd have a young guy, not, probably much different than some of you young men out here, maybe just out of college, had their first good job, and to celebrate, they go out and they buy their first new-to-them car. And they'd come in and say, I've had this car about a year. So we dug into the budget, and I said, what about this car? And typically on a budget, you've got categories for housing, food, clothing, and they fall into percentage parameters, the way I look at it. Transportation would fall into a category that you could put about 20% of your take-home income into not only the payment, but also gas, which has gone up, insurance, which is not cheap for a young man, licensing, maintenance, and all those things. And we'd look at it, and instead of 20%, it'd be 40, 45, 50% on some of these guys. And he'd say, I know I can't make the payment. I just simply can't make it. I said, what's the solution? Well, I borrowed close to $20,000. I put very much money down. I still owe $18,000, but the car I've checked is worth $14,000, $15,000. It's depreciated. And that's that condition of being upside down I mentioned to you. The car's value is quickly depreciated, and yet because the loan amount didn't amortize the debt very quickly, they're upside down the first few years. So I say, what's going to happen? Well, I can't sell it and pay it off. So I guess I'll just give it back to the bank. I made a mistake, and I'll endeavor to do better next time. Well, how many of you in here have a car? How many of you in here have a car loan? A few of you. Okay. All right. I'm glad I'm getting to some of you before you make this decision. The auto loan documents that you will sign says that not only will you pledge the collateral, but you will promise from a personal standpoint to guarantee the loan and repay it. They don't care what the car brings. Now, you turn that car back, you get a repossession. It's a negative mark on your credit for the next 7 years. There's a lot of negatives. And you think that car is going to bring $15,000, they'll be lucky to get 10 or 11 at auction. Let's say it brings 10. The $8,000 is a deficiency balance, and that's the reality. And I remember some of the young guys saying, well, can't get that for me. I don't have it. I say, yeah, but you got a job. You don't make the arrangements to their satisfaction. They're going to take you to court, sue you, get a judgment. And with that judgment, they're going to execute on it by garnishing your wages. 25% of your check now goes away to the creditor. And you were struggling to make things meet right now. I say, what would have happened? And I used to say this if I had time. If you could step back in time and instead of the 5-year loan that you see in front of you, you take out a 36-month, 3-year loan. I laid that out on paper. The young guy said, well, Mr. Coates, you're nuts. I couldn't make the payments at $415. How could I make them at $636, right? I say, exactly. You had an illusion once again created for you, in this case by a car salesman who was out after his own self-interest, nothing against them. My grandfather was a Chevy car dealer for 50 years. I have nothing against car salesmen and car dealers. But you have to look out for your own self-interest. Do not, just because they tell you that everybody buys a car and finances it for 5 or 6 years, do not take that as what's in your best interest. Look at a 36-month loan. You plug that into your budget, and instead of the $20,000 vehicle, you get a 10. Okay, you've identified, first off, what's affordable. You've eliminated being upside down, which is a big deal. I've had people in my office that I almost ran into a deer. I and my wife almost ran into a big deer the other night. They're out there. They can pop up at a moment's notice. You can crash the car. You can total it. The insurance company pays off what the car is worth. They don't care what you've got borrowed against it. And I've had people come in with thousands of dollars in debt because they were upside down, through no fault of their own, get involved in a car accident, paid off, thousands of dollars in debt and no car. And that's the reality, and that's the danger of being upside down. The last one is an important one. You're not used to that money coming into your lifestyle. You're used to that $300-400 a month going into a car payment. Now put the money into a reserve fund. Regularly plug it into that reserve fund, and the next time you go car shopping, you'll have either a very large down payment or you start becoming your own financing source. You're paying cash for it. Unheard of, I know. But this takes you off that treadmill. Remember what I said about Solomon's quote about the borrower becoming the slave of the lender. Take yourself off of that borrowing treadmill. So many people retire with more debt than they have assets. You see them working late at night at McDonald's or wearing a blue vest in Walmart, not because at 75 they want a more fulfilling life, because they want to continue to put bread on the table, and that's the only way they've got to do it. This next chart illustrates it. I've just talked to you about the problems with compound interest, year after year after year, beating you down and being in debt all the time. Here's the flip side. At age 25, which many of you aren't there yet, if you start putting $2,000 a year away and you earn an annualized rate of return at 8%, at age 65, over $600,000 is how much you have. And I didn't take into account the additional advantage in this calculation of the tax deduction aspect of it. But if you wait just 10 years and having been 25 and having a young family and then being 35, there's a lot of reasons you don't want to put $2,000 a year away this year. We'll do it next year. So you wait till you're 35 and you start doing the same thing. $2,000 a year, same rate of return, $266,000. That's not a bad number. But it's nowhere near $600,000. And if some of you out here start a couple years earlier, and your generation will not be able to retire at 65. 65 was an arbitrary number that was come up with in the 30s when the average person didn't live to be 65. And if they did get past 65, they didn't get very far past it. You're going to have to go closer to 70 in all likelihood. And at that point, early dollars, consistent, $1 million plus is what's in that account. Compound interest working for you, ask the lender, not the borrower, is the ticket to financial success. Getting out of those debt traps and getting in a position where you have your money work for you. And the earlier you do it, the better. You wait till you're a guy my age, it's way too late. You don't have enough time. I just skipped through the information sheet that we use. I'll just comment for a minute on it. This is the back section of the information sheet that the clients fill out for the counselors when they come in to see us. And we do this hundreds of times a month. The fantasy land that many of them are living in is evident when you get to the monthly living expenses. They'll come in and they'll have nothing down. They're a homeowner, but they've got nothing down for home maintenance. They own a car, but they don't show anything for car maintenance. They show clothing at $10 a month, and they've got a family of 5. You dig into it and you say, this is not realistic. Let's be realistic. And you start talking them through that, and you put realistic numbers down, and that's when the light bulb goes off over their heads. They see, I'm making X, I'm spending Y. Y is bigger than X. No wonder I have $30,000 in credit card debt. And it's oftentimes about that simple. And you tell them you either got to expand that income pie, which these days isn't as easy as it was a few years ago, or you've got to shrink that living expense item. You've got to shrink that. Now, let's say you develop some areas that are problems for you. I and my wife tend to like to eat out too much. It's costlier than eating at home or brown bag in the lunches. Let's say that you've determined that that's a problem. Let's say that clothing might be a problem. You're spending too much on clothing. You go to something as simple as this, the old envelope budgeting. And whether you want to take it to a high-tech level and do it in a fancy way, it makes no difference. The process is essentially the same. Look over on the side that says envelopes on the want-tos. You see clothing, you see meals out, you see Christmas. I did a TV interview today, and I reiterated that the average family will spend $900 to $1,000 each year on Christmas gifts. Many of those people don't put money aside for it, so it goes on to the credit card, another one of those traps. You take some of those traps that are earmarked for you. Maybe you've got hobbies that are expensive and you need to tone that down. You take an envelope out, and after you accurately put your budget together by tracking yourself, and then you go back and redo the budget, and now you say, okay, I've been spending $500 a month on meals out. I need to cut that down to about $200 or $250. You're paid twice a month. You take a $100 bill every time you're paid, and you put in this envelope marked meals out. You use that for your meals out. Same thing with clothing. You want to spend, maybe you've been spending thousands of dollars, but you should. Ladies spend $1,100, $1,200 a year annually in clothing. Guys spend about half of that. But whatever number that you come up with, you put that into the envelope. And when you want that new pair of shoes or that new coat, enough money in there, fine, go get it. It serves as a rationing mechanism, and it keeps you within your boundaries. You got enough money in there? The interesting thing about that whole process is, and this is human nature, when you put money aside, and maybe it's for a family vacation like I talked about earlier, you put the money aside, you're anticipating the activity, whether buying a new coat or going out to eat. The anticipation of that activity greatly enhances the enjoyment of that activity. It's just human nature. And so you will enjoy the money that you're spending even as more than when the money was more. It's like the little kid at Christmas who gets 20 gifts and appreciates none of them. He gets 2, and he really takes an interest in playing with them. And the same way with adults. And so that basic premise, the old envelope budgeting system or some high-tech version of it, is what I recommend to any one of all of you. Because I'll bet you all have certain problem areas in your budget that if you addressed it, the dollars would start to accumulate. Instead of, coming up short, before the payday is, you've got money to spare. I could talk a little bit. I'm out of time. I won't. I could get into FICO scores and this and that, just to say that the range for the Fair Isaac Credit Organization runs from 300 to 850 with an average of 675. And there's a lot of things that make it up, and I wish I had more time, but I can see I haven't watched my time very closely, Steve, so I'm run up against it. I do want to have a time for some Q&A. So I'm going to shut it down. I should have shut down a few minutes ago. I'm sorry I wasn't paying better attention. And open it up and let you ask me any questions that you'd like. Yes, sir. 8%. I used that some years ago because on a long-term basis, the market had yielded 8%. And you may be right, and maybe I wouldn't argue this a bit. It may be difficult to to achieve an 8%, but let's say you're looking at 5 or 6. I think on a long-term basis we can at least look at that. The model still holds up. It doesn't show up quite as much money, but it's still a model that holds up. Those early dollars are very important. Other questions? Yes, sir. Repeat that question for me.
How much of a percentage of down payment do you think a person should have for a long-term asset?
You talking about a house?
Or a car?
Oh, well, again, my advice on the car is to only take out a 36-month loan, put as much down as you possibly can, and eventually only pay cash for it. Take care of it, maintain it, do all the things that good stewardship requires. On a house, that's not quite so easy. But I think now that the lending requirements on the part of the bank have been tightened up dramatically, you're not going to get by with some of these funny money things that they were doing, and so you're going to look at least 20% down. And ideally, especially with these low rates, if you can't do a 15-year mortgage on a house and cut that back into your budget, you're probably looking at too much house. And again, the housing portion of the budget, with not only the house payment, but the real estate taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, all those things shouldn't run more than about 34 to 36% of your budget. And so at least 20% down and a 15-year mortgage would be what I'd be looking at. It's a good question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you have any specific comments regarding student loans?
Pardon? What? Student loans. All right. And I think I need to incorporate this because another, 8% increase in the cost of higher education in this country this year. There is no doubt that, again, my situation in the 70s is far different than your situation, just because the price has gone up so much. I think you need to plan out. I think you need to apply for scholarships more actively. I think you need to work as much as you possibly can. I think you need to avail yourself of all the opportunities for the least expensive education you can get, and most importantly, aim in an area that has marketability. I had a woman call up just the other day, and she said, I've got $40,000 in student loans. She's got a 4-year degree in some area that isn't very marketable. And she said, even if I go out and get the absolute best job I can't pay off my student loans and pay enough to live. You've got to go somewhere. I was talking about this with my son a while back, and we looked at some areas. Geology was one he has some interest in, and there's a lot of demand for geologists, engineering, those kinds of things. And I'm not going to stand up here and pretend that I'm going to tell you any better than anybody that's sitting out here, the ins and outs of finance, but just from a practical standpoint, you need to keep your financing cost as low as possible, make as much as you can. Do not assume that this student loan debt that now Iowa, I just read an article the other day, said Iowa was the 3rd highest state in the union for the amount of student loan debt coming in. I think Connecticut was tops at over 29, but we were 28 something. And so Iowa, for reasons that I can't fathom, are particularly expensive when it comes to the amount of student loan debt. You've got to work to keep that down, pay off, borrow as little as possible, because this is not a debt that goes away. I've mentioned bankruptcy. Most of you know. If you don't, you better, because federally insured student loan doesn't get discharged in bankruptcy. You got to deal with it. Either that or leave the country. Yes, ma'am. Repeat it. Okay, that's a good question. Well, the best way for college students to create credit, and it is important, especially in this environment right now, that you go out. Again, I won't get back into my credit scoring talk, but it is very important that you get some areas of credit established. Now, some people say, and I know that Dave Ramsey says, you know, in essence, live off the grid. I don't think that's practical, because the importance of the credit score and trying to build that up and keep it clean is not only from a financing standpoint. It's also utilized oftentimes for insurance. The ability to get decent priced insurance may hinge on how well you've used your credit and your credit score. And lastly, maybe to this group especially, the most important thing is getting that job. If you're going to stay in this area and many others, oftentimes the employers, in this area in particular, with financing and insurance being the big employers in this area, they will use the credit score and the credit reports oftentimes to analyze applicants. You want to get a job with Principal or Wells Fargo or somebody like that, they use credit reports all the time. That becomes a paramount importance to you, because if you're in a competitive environment, and you are, and the one you're competing against has used his credit very wisely, and he has a high credit score, and you've made some mistakes, and you're down in the... Let me explain the credit score this way. I'm a sports handicapper, and I'm looking at two horses. I've got one horse here that wins almost all the time. I'm going to score them over 800 on their credit score. I've got another nag that barely finishes the race, and I'm going to score that one about a 500. And that's what the lenders are looking at. They're looking at this credit scoring model as a handicap to your opportunities, your likelihood of repaying. And if you've got a low credit score and you've got a lot of dings on your credit report, the likelihood is you won't repay. And the employer looks at that and says, if he can't handle his personal finances any more responsibly than this, he's probably not going to be a good employee for me to hire. And you can say, well, that's not fair. Well, that's the world as it is. And you can argue, and you can pitch a tent downtown, and you can rail against Wells Fargo, or you can take the world as it is. And the world as it is requires, if you want that job, and I was approached the other day by somebody who had been turned down for a promotion because in this promotion contest, this person hadn't handled their finances very well, and they denied the promotion. So keep that in mind as you go forward, and try not to make any more mistakes than necessary. It can be very costly. It may cost you a job. Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of protesting Wells Fargo, you said a lot of the issues with the financial crisis can be traced back to government.
Yes.
What kind of policies would you like to see changed or replaced? What do you think as a financial expert could be done to help?
Well, back in the 70s, when I got out of college, in 76, I was hired at that time as the youngest broker that this Des Moines office had ever hired in the Merrill Lynch office. And I've been watching the finances for some time, and I don't have time to go into everything that ought to happen. I think there's two things that ought to happen to really put us on solid ground. One is in 1971, Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. We became what was known, and everybody else is too, I know, a fiat currency. That is an invitation for inevitable disaster. In fact, I don't think you can find a time in human history that a fiat currency within 30, 40 years hasn't led to a crisis in their currency. And we're heading that way. The other thing I would do is I would put into place in the government, and I don't normally advocate any significant role of federal government, but I would take out the opportunity for money to come into the campaigns. I like the idea of limited terms, but moreover, I want to take the money out of the campaigns. I would disallow the ability to do any significant amount of lobbying other than for informational purposes on bills. And I would take the money out and I would make them much more accountable. And I would not allow a politician, when he retires, to go to work for anybody that has a real interest for at least 10 years. And I would not allow a politician that had a wife lobbying for a particular interest to come in front of the entity that I was sitting on the board of in the Senate or the House and ply that lobbying trade. That, at least I agree that much with the protesters. I think those two things, you get us back into an asset-based currency. Gold is the only thing throughout human history that gold and silver shows up as the practical one. and you take the money and the lobbying out of our federal government and you make the politicians accountable. Warren Buffett's got an idea. He says if they spend more than over 3% of the GDP, throw them out. But make them accountable. Those are the two easiest things I can tell you. There's a lot more to it, obviously, but those are two. If you could do those two things, within a generation, we'll be back in some solid footing, I think. Yes, ma'am.
Where do you suggest we go to find out our credit score?
Okay, good question. Glad you asked it. Two areas. Credit report first. Separate item. Annualcreditreport.com. Annualcreditreport.com. You can get a copy of any one of your 3 credit reports from the 3 major credit bureaus at no cost, once a year. MyFICO, MyFICO, myfico.com lets you go and get a copy of your credit score. Much different. Cost you something, 15, 20 bucks, not that much. And it's an education of itself to start digging in and finding out some of what makes up the credit score. If you haven't done it, I invite you to do it. I did it a few years ago because I was asked to write an article for a financial newsletter. And in doing the research, I actually got all 3 of my credit scores from all 3 of the bureaus. Each one will put out a different credit score. And there was a 40-point swing from high to low. My information wasn't significantly different, but there's a lot of difference in those credit scores. So if you really want to dig into it, get all 3 of them. It'll cost you a little bit more, but again, it's an education. Good question. I'm glad you asked that. Anything else? Anybody up in the peanut gallery got a question? All right. Last chance. I'm going to let you go here in a minute. Okay. Got another question?
What part of the financial system played a real estate bubble burst in late 2005?
What part? Well, again, it was the Alan Greenspan came into the Fed chair with high expectations. He had known more about. He'd been an advocate of hard money. He'd been a fan of Ayn Rand. If any of you have ever read Atlas Shrugged. High expectations, a brilliant man. Sold out to the very thing that I'm saying the politicians sell out to, the siren song of power. He became the most powerful man in the world, arguably. And to keep that thing rolling, he created endless amounts of money and artificially low interest rates. It wasn't just at key times. He did it year after year. And so the bubbles, the high tech and then the housing bubble, inevitably were going to pop up somewhere. And those high tech, we could live past that. The housing bubble was infinitely more destructive. And we are going to see, I think, quite a few years yet of the hangover from that housing bubble. Until housing and employment stabilize and bottom, there's little chance that the economy is going to turn around. But without some of the more important fundamental changes, it's going to be short term, and we're going to be suffering a long time until we get back down to bedrock. Good question. Okay, one more if you've got it, and then I'm going to let you go because I know I've drug this out a little bit. Any other last minute questions? Guys? It? Okay. All right, thank you for your attention.